What an honor, truly an honor for African Ascent International to invite a phenomenal musical figure and also a professor of professors at Berklee College of Music for the first time to African Ascent International. Of course, Professor Terri Carrington does not require any introduction. I'll have to be terribly preposterous to give one, which I'm not inclined to do. But I simply want to say the following. Many describe her, although she disdains descriptions I have learned from researching her, a genius, prodigious child who emerged as early as the age of 10, made it to Berklee at the age of 11. I may be confusing the dates, but I'll give her an ample time to set the record right and give us an analytically precise documentation of who she is, where she came from, what she does now, and where she's heading. And additionally, at the expense of embarrassing her, she is also described as a genius. There is no doubt in my mind, having been obsessed with listening to her albums and reading on her, that she indeed is this particular description. Her albums have won numerous nominated and also eventually won, I hope I'm right, about 3 Grammys. And I think she's also working on one now that I'm sure, because she's much more seasoned than she was when she began at 10, to win another Grammy. How lucky for us at Berklee College of Music to proudly share her presence and her achievements and her passions and dreams. I could say considerably more, but I think I'll stop at this point, and now the interview begins officially. And so what I thought I would do, Professor Terri Carrington, is to give you an opportunity to speak about your childhood.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that unbelievable introduction. I'm sitting here wondering who you're talking about. But thank you. You're so kind. Yeah, I did start at Berklee when I was 11. You did have those dates correct. I got a scholarship there, a full scholarship from sitting in with Oscar Peterson, and the president of the college and his wife were at the concert. So they heard me sit in and offered me a scholarship the next day. And I actually had been going there for about a year, just taking lessons. I was taking drum lessons from Keith Copeland and piano lessons from Dean Earle. But my first teacher was my dad, and he played drums and saxophone. So first I started on saxophone, trying to copy him. And then I moved on to the drums when I was 7. And he showed me what he knew. And then I went on to some teachers. And I think really what happened to me, I was very fortunate to have a family that was so supportive, but also, a father that knew everyone. So I had access to all these amazing jazz musicians. When they would come through Boston, because it was so close to New York, every week we had legendary jazz musicians playing the clubs in Boston. So that would be, of course, the Jazz Workshop in Pall Mall. It was on Boylston Street. We had Lulu White's somewhere in the South End, and Sandy's Jazz Revival in Beverly. In Cambridge, there was a place called the Rise Club. And I'm forgetting some, but there were lots of places to go. So every week it seemed I went out to hear some amazing musicians, and my father would tell them about me, and often they would let me sit in with them. So I grew up jamming with B.B. King and Dizzy Gillespie and Clark Terry and just so many people, the list goes on. And that was a very unique childhood. And I have to say, if it wasn't for my father and for those experiences, I don't think that I'd be who I am today or where I am today.
Okay. Well, I want us to delve in even deeper. Break it down for me. How was the musical environment composed of these powerful instruments, the piano and the saxophone, the presence of your father. And I'm also told that your grandfather, the legendary Matt Carrington, was also a musician. And so it's very obvious that music, as it were, is in the blood of the family, and in that you inherited this legacy. This must have been quite burdensome at the age of 10, Professor Carrington.
I didn't really think about it like that. I was so young that I was really just having fun. And I think that's really key. If you see a young person, a child, with an aptitude towards something, and you can also make it fun for them, or you can embrace the fact that they're having fun with something and support that, then I think that's kind of what helps to shape young careers. So my grandfather, he passed away before I was born, about 6 months before I was born, so I never met him. But his drums were in the house, and I had asked my dad to set them up, and I just kind of never stopped. So I didn't really see it as a burden or any pressure, anything like that. I did know from a young age that this is what I wanted to do. I really never had the desire to do anything else. So I do agree with you that it's in the blood. It's something that was just always there. I don't remember ever discovering jazz or really even discovering the drums. They were always there.
And now, Professor, I would like us to talk about your role models. He must have had so many of them if you're jamming with Coltrane.
Oh, no, not Coltrane. I did not. He died probably right around the time I was born. And that, well, I can't remember the exact year, but no, I was too young.
You were too young.
But I was jamming with Elvin Jones and McCoy Tyner, who was in Coltrane's band, yeah. But as far as role models go, what's interesting is I did not have any women role models, especially on the drums. There were really no other women that I saw playing drums.
No.
When I was a kid, at some point, I went to Detroit to do a festival, a women's jazz festival, and that's the first time I remember seeing a woman playing drums, which was Dottie Dodgen, and she was playing, I forget with who, but I think Mary Watkins maybe, or maybe not Mary Watkins. Yeah, Mary Watkins had a woman drummer too, Linda Tillery. So those two people, I think, were the first two people I ever saw. But I was probably, I had been already playing, several years, and I was on the bill with them. The male role models were just all the legendary drummers that I saw. Roy Haynes, who was also from Boston. Elvin Jones, Buddy Rich was an influence and a supporter. He helped me get my endorsements when I was 10 or 11. Jack DeJohnette, he became my biggest role model and mentor when I was 18, and has remained so really until this day. And then, of course, Wayne Shorter, he became a huge influence and mentor when I was 21 and has remained so. There were other people. I had befriended the members of Sweet Honey in the Rock and looked up to them and felt like they were mentors and role models. And it was great to see such powerful women in the business, even though they weren't necessarily a jazz group. It was just powerful Black music, so I was very drawn to them. Diane Reeves, she's like a big sister to me. I met her when I was 10 years old, and she was in her late teens, and we were both guests with Clark Terry at the Wichita Jazz Festival in Kansas. So there were women that I met and the women in my life that proved to be mentors, to a degree. And but that's a little different than a role model as far as drummers.
But Professor Carrington, I'm going to push even harder now. Modesty aside, he must have been quite something to dare to be a drummer at the time. It is simply something that wasn't on the musical visual landscape. So the fact that you dared to become what you have become now, you've set the stage for a generation of women. Thanks to you, women are now proudly walking on the Berklee campus and aspiring to be, and thanks to the institute that you and Larry Simpson, because he too is a visionary, established. You have created a space for women's suppressed genius to unfold unapologetically. And of course, the promise of this began as early as 10, when he dared to go into this field. Modesty aside, I want you to think deeply about this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you hit on something important. It takes courage, to do anything that's not part of the normal fabric of life and society. I think there's a certain amount of fearlessness to play jazz, period. You have to be fearless. And to do it against the grain of what's been considered normal in the field takes even more courage.
Yes.
So I will agree with you. The thing is, when you're a kid, I don't think you're thinking about all that. So it's either part of who you are, or if it's not, and you're just kind of whimsical as a kid, then it might hurt you later. You might shut down, you might get discouraged, you might not continue if you don't have that courageous gene, so to say. I think also, I look at playing jazz as you have to have a warrior spirit. And I think that women definitely, have this warrior spirit. It's not always cultivated, but we have it. So, my good fortune was it never being shut down, never being a lid was not put on it, but it was always a part of me. So when I was, and I always think back to this particular incident when I was 10 years old, and I met Buddy Rich for the first time at this same festival I just mentioned, where I met Diane Reeves. He was in a bad mood, and people told me not to talk to him, but I did anyway. And he's, somebody introduced me, and the first thing out of his mouth was, "Oh yeah, well, you better not be any good." And then my natural inclination was to respond, "Well, who's going to stop me?" And he just kind of looked at me, and he said, "Hey, you want to come play with my band?" Because at 10, I stood up to him. That was just my natural fire, the fire inside of me. And what I realized later is that that's not necessarily normal for all women, and nor is it always accepted, socially, for women to have that kind of fire to kind of, hold their own with their male counterparts. So I feel like, I tried to create this space at Berklee so that it embraced women, whether they have that particular, fighter in them or not. Because I don't think you should have to have that to be successful in jazz, or to have the space to be creative, or to have the support to be creative, to even see what's there. And that was really kind of the premise of creating this particular space at Berklee.
And of course, you're also lucky in another sense. Correct me if I'm wrong. Most of my students at Berklee if not all. I did not do the statistical measurement, but I could reasonably assume that a substantial number of the students do not get the support that they deserve from their parents.
Mm-hmm.
In your case, I think you did.
Mm-hmm.
Your father, I did not read much about your mother's contribution, but I'm willing to learn from you, was not only supportive, but encouraging you, prodding you, developing you to unfold what is in the family blood. Would I be correct to make that assumption?
Absolutely. And my mother has always been there supportive as well. Every single gig I went to, club I went to, city I traveled to, both of my parents were there. And it was an exciting time, because they were both excited by the music alone, and for me to excel at a young age, it was exciting for all of us. And you're right, there's a difference between being just supported and being encouraged.
Yes, major difference.
Yes, and I'm very fortunate to have had both of those from my parents, and not just them, but the extended family, friends and family, in the neighborhood. I grew up in West Medford.
Yeah.
And also the community, the jazz community. People were very supportive for the most part. Of course, there was always a few people that were naysayers or that just didn't want to see anything different because they didn't believe that women really should be playing the music.
That's all.
It felt like it's kind of men's work.
Yeah, exactly.
So there were always those people, but I never paid attention to them because I think I knew at an early age to just appreciate, all the positive things and the people that were supportive, and to not focus on the negative or the people that weren't, and not let them get in my way either. In fact, I'm sure that they helped to drive me forward in some way as well. Just not that I ever really totally felt like I had to prove something, but there's always a healthy level of competition, in any art form. It's not sports exactly, but there's still a little bit of you have to have that thing that makes you want to be the best. And so I think that I learned at a young age that that desire is something that will carry you through, and if you work hard along with it, and you don't give up, then chances are the universe will support you.
At the expense of making you bashful, what you remind me of is what Hegel said about the nature of any craft, that nothing great is accomplished without passion, he says. I think you're a living example of that. You're a combination of passion and fierceness. I haven't had the opportunity to interact with you at Berklee College of Music. What a great loss, because I and you became hired at Berklee at exactly the same time. I came from Brown in 2007, 2006, I think, and you were hired in 2007. And yet we never met. All that I remember is that spectacular introduction that he gave to our heroine, Angela Davis, whom we have known for years, at an occasion that he prepared for her, which was done brilliantly. I have an image of that night in my skull. Now, we'll go to the next sections of the interview. I don't think I'm going to do justice to you in 1 hour. If you have time, I want to do at least 2 episodes with you. We'll talk about this for the future. Mm-hmm. So now, I want you to give me a crash course on what jazz is, what jazz standards are. Let's pretend as if the world doesn't know anything about jazz standards. I would like you to take your time and develop a descriptive introduction of what this craft is.
Okay. Jazz is Black music, first and foremost, birthed from the African-American experience, rooted in the blues. If you don't know what the blues is, I don't know what to say. I mean, the blues is a foundation of everything, all modern music, contemporary modern music. And jazz was a way that African Americans found a language, a creative language, where it didn't really matter what song you were playing. You could improvise and develop your own personality and language and qualities that made you individual, and also have a kind of freedom that you may not have in daily life. So I think these are the things that attracted people to playing the music and attracted people to listening to the music. If you can imagine a space that's like a playground, that you can kind of do anything, but you have to acknowledge, in most cases, a given set of boundaries. And I think the goal is to be free within those boundaries. And I think that that's what we're trying to do in life. We have a desire to be free within the structure of how we have to live. So I don't know of any other music form that does that quite like jazz, that mirrors the human spirit in the same way. And once you get bitten by that bug, it doesn't ever go away. You find this space of like a playground, like the space of creativity as becomes actually addictive, because for me personally, it's the one place I can go where I can totally be in the moment. Nothing else matters, because it demands that kind of attention, and so it's a very spiritual place, because you are forced to be in the moment. You're not necessarily, if it's great, you're not thinking about the past or the future, really. You don't have an agenda. And when you can let go like that, there's nothing like it. And that's why I find it to be a spiritual place to go. It's like much better for me than, going to church or any of those things. So within this language that was created in the earlier part of the 20th century, there was a certain kind of repertoire that went along with it, often composed, but sometimes based off of popular music of the time. So there was a lot of music that was considered jazz standards that really came from the theater. It came from plays, Broadway plays, and Tin Pan Alley and all of that. So what was revolutionary is how jazz musicians could take something that existed and turn it into something that the original composers and performers could not imagine, could not do, could not really participate in, and really just use those things as a vehicle for self-expression. And that was great, in that those things kind of remained intact over all of these years as far as learning this particular repertoire. What was important, very much needed, was that there were also a group of musicians that pretty much refused to play that repertoire, and came from the idea that jazz is always about moving forward. It's about progression. And why would we play music that somebody else has already played, music that somebody else has already written? So there's always been that kind of resistance to what's considered standard, and who sets those standards, and also who benefits financially from those standards. Because, every time you play somebody else's music, you're putting money in their pocket as well, So, in thinking about standards and a canon that we've all gone through for the most part, I realized that there weren't any women composers in that canon. So I started focusing on collecting songs, music written by women composers. So we've worked on a book called New Standards, 101 lead sheets by women composers, in the same lead sheet style that these jazz standards were presented in what was called the Real Book, or is called the Real Book. So we're making another book called New Standards, but it's also, it has a double meaning, because we're also trying to set new standards, a standard where women aren't excluded or erased from participation.
Well, which naturally leads me to ask you to address the next major contribution that you have made, which I want to do on an episode of its own, because I want to do an episode with you specifically on gender and music. So now let me just ask a question just on the surface, namely this concept of erasure. I would like you to develop that as well as you can. Take your time. What is being erased? Who is erasing it? Why are they erasing it? Under what conditions could it be salvaged? There are 4 slices to the question. So you can take slice by slice. Take your time. I want to learn from you, as is my audience.
Well, I always say that I'm not an expert in any of this. I'm just somebody that has participated and has seen what, I've seen what I've seen, but I haven't studied as much as people that have, gotten their degrees in whatever, ethnomusicology or gender studies or whatever it is. I've not done any of that. So all of the things that I talk about are pretty much from my own life and what I've observed from my colleagues and peers. So I always like to clarify that these are my views, but they're not, and don't get me wrong, I've done some reading, but not in a formal way at all. So as far as erasure, who is erasing? The dominant group, they're the only ones that benefit from erasure. And so that's why we say jazz without patriarchy, because patriarchy seems to be the root of the problem. Of course, you have within that, you have sexism and racism and all of those things, but this patriarchal structure has been around for a long time, and it seems to mostly benefit white or white men of European descent that are what's the word? It's kind of the norm. I forget there's a word for it. But anyway, people with resources, white, Anglo-Saxon, Christian, able-bodied, with resources. So that seems to be the root of the problem. And so who's going to benefit from keeping, women in their place? I mean, what's really funny to me is, these same people, their families, their societies, their communities will actually benefit from minorities participating in moving everything forward, women being, a minority in that way. I don't know, we're not necessarily a minority if you look at just the numbers in society, but we are a minority when it comes to true participation and equality, of course, and being compensated equally and all of those things. We're marginalized. So I think, first thing is you have to try to make people understand that everyone benefits from this kind of thinking, from equality and equity. And I don't understand, why that's so hard, but it just seems that there's always going to be some kind of desire for a ruling class. And I'm not sure that'll ever go away, or we would have, some kind of utopia, right? And I'm not sure I fully believe in that. But as we, I forget who said it, and I forget the exact quote, but basically, it's the idea. You take two steps forward and one step back. But there's a quote that I think it was Martin Luther King, actually. And I hate to start quoting because I'll always mess them up. But basically, like, the history has taught us that things will eventually move forward, no matter what we're facing. It seems like it won't. These things will it's on the side of transformation and things moving forward. So as far as who's doing it, I think that we have, actually, women are participating in holding each other back too. We've been socialized and brainwashed to be invested in this kind of thing, either because it's not just women. If I was speaking more generally, minorities want to sometimes be the exception or the only one, and so that type of thinking holds us back as well. So that was one of the first things I had to realize, that there are a lot of women as well that need to be educated and encouraged to think differently and to look at this as, collective work and a group effort, and that there's no true benefit of being the exception. Being the exception actually holds back real progress. So I think that's, part of the puzzle that a lot of people don't put together. It's not like, it's not that men are the only ones that are, not really invested sometimes in dismantling patriarchy. So, and what has been erased? Well, in jazz, there were a lot of women that showed potential, that worked, that created, in especially when you go back to the 40s, during World War II, when a lot of women big bands and women musicians thrived because so many of the men were away. And so that always blows my mind, that how, when the war was over, a lot of women disappeared. They I don't know what happened. I wasn't there, but it did happen. I don't know if it's just that the presenters stopped hiring them, or their husbands came home and they needed to just go back to doing domestic work, or it was just not fun anymore because they weren't encouraged and they were discouraged. I think probably all of those things happened, but it's amazing how many women were playing and thriving, and then how later, in the 50s, it seemed like in the 60s, it seemed like they weren't there quite the same. So I think part of the work is looking back and uncovering people that were there, that even if they weren't erased, they didn't get their full recognition. So that's part of the work, looking back and uncovering these people to say, yes, they were there. And then the other part is looking at the present and looking toward a future, and transforming the present into a future that's even more equitable. And so I think it's, it's two arms of the type of work that is needed. And what was your other question?
No, you covered all of them. And now you did not even leave a slice of what I asked. You did it beautifully.
Okay.
Of course, as you know, our great thinker, Bell Hooks, who just passed away, would be another comrade of yours, in addition to Angela Davis, because she too is very critical of patriarchy and erasure and so on. Did you know Bell Hooks at all? Have your paths crossed? Did you ever meet her?
No, I didn't know that she passed.
You didn't? Yes.
No.
Yes. 1 week ago.
I see.
At the age of 69. You've never met her then?
No, I did not. Yeah, she was amazing.
She was an amazing critique of what they call erasure. Her entire life was bringing back the contributions of women, most particularly working class women. She did not racially discriminate. She simply wanted, very much like you, to bring in those who have been erased, those who have been marginalized, those who have been invisibilized, to be visible. It's as if we need another book by someone like Ralph Ellison, which should be called The Invisible Woman, which we yet have to do. Again, the interview has hardly begun, and I know you're exceptionally busy, and I can't demand much of your time, but how wonderful it would be for you to consider coming to our fantastic studio in Melrose with your band and do a show. And then I'll ask you a few questions, but I won't ask you to come and perform for 1 hour. But if you could come with the band, I just saw a piece that you did in the Tidy Room for NPR. That was extraordinary. And I'm so jealous. I would like to do something like that in our studio. But this is for you to consider.
Yes.
Humbly asking for the possibility. Now, we have about 10 minutes left, and I think I would like you just briefly as you can, because I want to save these sets of questions for part 2, and talk about exceptionalism. What is that about? It's a companion concept to erasure. What do you mean by exceptionalism? You're very critical of it, and from what I learned, quite rightly.
Well, I just feel like we're just human nature, maybe to some degree, is geared toward, like I said earlier, there's a certain competitive spirit that you have to have in this music, because I mean, there's so many people doing it, and it's not a music that is popular, so you don't get paid a lot. So the very best musicians or the ones that get the most attention. Sometimes they're not the best, but the ones that get the most attention the ones that make the best living, of course. So I can understand why people, when they're exceptional, when they're the top of a very small group. If you're speaking of women in jazz, it's a very small group. And I'm not speaking of singers. Women have always been able to thrive as singers, vocalists, but as instrumentalists, it's just, it's almost been non-existent. The numbers have been quite low, especially for instruments that aren't, instruments themselves have been gendered. So it was acceptable for women to play certain instruments like piano, flute, but not others. So if you play one of those other instruments like drums or trumpet or bass, and you were good, then you would get all the attention. And you became, ran the risk of becoming also, what's the word I'm looking for? Not a gimmick, but, to become sensationalized or whatever, because you're, the top of a very small group. But that's very short-sighted. And I, understand why people have kind of been okay with that, because it helps their career, helps their livelihood. If there's not a lot of other people doing the same thing, a lot of other people that look like you doing the same thing. But that's, just really bad, because one, then you're counted. Like we learned from Lara Pellegrinelli, who headed this NPR poll that said, equal at last with a question mark, because all of the top women artists could rise to the top or be in, say, the top 10 of a jazz poll. But then when you look at the top 100, they're not there as much as they are in the top 10. So things haven't changed as much as they appear to change when you celebrate the women that are on top, because often you start celebrating the same women over and over again. So I had read an article a while ago that she wrote for National Sawdust, where it basically said, sure, we have Esperanza and Terri Lyne, but what about the rest? And, that made me start to think differently about that. Because, I get tired of seeing my name or Esperanza's name, referenced. And when there's, there are others, but when you keep, this idea of, these are the exceptional ones. First of all, they're exceptional because if there's an exception, to me, it's like, there's a rule. That's why there's an exception. It's almost like an exception to a rule, an existing rule or standard. So first of all, by saying that we're an exception, it's pointing to the problem, pointing to the fact that there aren't enough, which is the problem. But being okay with being an exception is even more problematic, because, it means that you're, you're in essence part of the problem if you're not working diligently to make that not so. And if we go back and look at even someone like Mary Lou Williams, we were pretty much trained to believe that we didn't want to play with other women. And that wasn't just, being comfortable being an exception. It was that we've been trained to think that women aren't as good. So why would we want to play with the group that's not as good? You know what I mean? And you can substitute all of this for race and, all of these things. To me, I always, substitute, look at race and gender as companions, So many of the same things are, so many of the things, the issues are the same, You can swap out the words sometimes, and it's just the same. But anyway, so I think you have to look at the fact that women have to be great. They have to just be okay. They have to be bad. They have to have the freedom to exist in, all the tiers of success and all the tiers of ability. And when we have that, that's when there will be more equality.
Incredible. Again, at the expense of repeating myself, this is only the tip of the iceberg. I really have not done a full-fledged interview. I yet have.
I'll come back anytime you want. I enjoyed talking to you.
I am going.
You're amazing.
Thank you so much. And I yet have to speak about your institute. I yet have to speak about you as a teacher who turned your back against the celebrity status that life gave you because you wanted to be in a scholarly academic setting and pass on your gifts to generations that you come. That by itself constitutes an episode. I want the world to see you as a teacher. And of course, as a performer, but as a performer, you're already well known. So you need not perform for anybody. So I haven't gone to these dimensions. We yet have to talk about what you brilliantly said in one of your interviews when someone asked you, what is the role of music? You were sort of charmed by it. You said, what do you mean? Life is music, paraphrasing you somewhat accurately. We yet have to dissect that proposition. So meaningful, so intelligent. So anyway, why don't I finish the first part today by giving you the 5 minutes that are left and use them in any way you want, please.
Wow, in any way I want?
Please.
I would turn it around and ask you some questions. I mean, you're so brilliant, yourself. So, I hope, that we get to hang out some more in the future and I can learn from you.
Oh, no, on the contrary. I am the one who has to learn from you. As I said, it's a loss because I'm a little bit shy. I should have come to your office to get to know you. I didn't, but we're still young. We have many, many years ahead of us. So
yes, we're lucky. Yes,
our friendship will begin. So,
I just want to say that it is collective work. So we learn from each other. There's no hierarchy here. It's just moving the culture forward, moving our communities forward. Just the work that we do in educating, but just the work that we do to create the world that we want to live in. That's collective work. Nobody does it alone. So I think it's important to have that attitude, especially when it comes to teaching. In these learning institutions, it sometimes feels too hierarchical, and I feel like we have to listen more and let the students, the young people, lead us more. And I don't see enough of that. I feel like that's the only way to really ensure, our future. It's kind of the youth and elders. I mean, I'm sure in other cultures, they come together differently, than they do in ours. And I feel that teaching gives us that opportunity. So one reason why I like to do it is it keeps me relevant. It keeps me honest. It keeps me just up to date with what's happening in the world. I couldn't possibly just hang out with people of my own generation or older and understand what's going on in the world, even develop a point of view. I need the input, from younger people to see what's really happening, what's happening right now, not what's happening from my 56-year-old outlook on things. That's cool, but I'm more interested to see where we're going than to see where we've been.
And now, may I modestly and kindly, and I mean this from my heart, ask you to thank your parents for giving us the extraordinary, phenomenal Professor Terri Carrington to develop a new generation of great musicians outside of the matrix of sex, race, and class by anchoring it in human intelligence. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Has been your host, Teodros Kiros for African Ascent International. Thank you so much.